Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for our evening Bible lesson. We are going to continue our look into the book of Judges. Now, today we're going to look at a judge by the name of Ehud. He's the second judge that is recorded in this book. The third judge is Shamgar. We probably won't look at Shamgar too much, only I think if you look at verse 31 of chapter 3 of Judges, there's only one verse that covers Shamgar, um, and not really a lot of things to go on there for an entire lesson. But just wanted to make sure that we mentioned him as well. But today we're going to look at Ehud, who is the second judge, and his story can be found in Judges chapter 3, and it's after verse 11, which finishes the story of Othniel that we looked at in the last lesson. So we're actually going to start in verse 12, and we're going to read the entire account. And I'm reading from the English Standard Version, so if you want to read along or just listen, that's fine too. Judges chapter 3, we're going to start in verse 12, and we're going to go down through the 30th verse. It says, "And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He gathered to himself the Ammonites and the Amalekites, and went and defeated Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. And the people of Israel served Eglon the king of Moab 18 years. Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. The people of Israel sent tribute to him by Eglon the king of Moab, and Ehud made for himself a sword with two edges, a cubit in length, and bound it on his right thigh under his clothes. And he presented the tribute to Eglon king of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man." We're in verse 18 now. "And when Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent away the people who carried the tribute. But he himself turned back at the idols near Gilgal and said, 'I have a secret message for you, O king.' And he commanded silence. And all his attendants went out from his presence. And Ehud came to him as he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber. And Ehud said, 'I have a message from God for you.' And he arose from his seat. And Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. And the hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not pull the sword out of his belly, and the dung came out. Then Ehud went into the porch, closed the doors of the roof chamber behind him, and locked them. And when he had gone, the servants came, and when they saw that the doors of the roof chamber were locked, they thought, 'Surely he is relieving himself in the closet of the cool chamber.' And they waited till they were embarrassed. And when they still did not open the doors of the roof chamber, they took the key and opened them, and there lay their lord dead on the floor. He had escaped while they delayed, and he passed beyond the idols, and escaped to Seirah. When he arrived, he sounded the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim. Then the people of Israel went down with him from the hill country, and he was their leader. And he said to them, 'Follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand.' So they went down after him, and seized the fords of Jordan against the Moabites. They did not allow anyone to pass over. They killed at that time about 10,000 of the Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men. Not a man escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years. Okay, so that's the story of Ehud. A somewhat shocking story if you've never read it before or never heard it before. We can learn a few things here. We have to look beyond what seems to be a story of strategy and interesting strategy. There's some things there that are mentioned, and of course, the Bible is like any other book. The only reason you mention something when you're telling a story, is if it has bearing on either the past of the story as it leads up to it, or the present of the story, or if it is foreshadowing something. And so this is dealing with the present of the story. A lot of the small details that we must not overlook is dealing with things that are very important. And the reason that they are seen as important is because if so many things did not fall into place when Ehud made his plan and practiced his plan, put it into practice, then it wouldn't have worked out. Everything had to go according to plan, and we're going to talk about that here in a few minutes and how that relates to God and the providence of God. But first, there's a couple things I want us to think about when it comes to Ehud. Number one, we know the Bible gives us details about who he is. A lot of these things may not mean a lot to us. The son of Gera, we don't really know, who Gera is as far as I can tell. But what we do understand is they're really giving his identification, his credentials here. It'd be just like telling your first name and your last name, because we didn't have, last names were not a thing until the Middle Ages, and Middle Ages in Europe is how that got started for tax purposes and identification purposes. So they identified you. A lot of people had the same first name, obviously, as we do today, and they would identify you as the son of such and such, and also maybe even a larger identification. He's the son of Gera from the tribe of Benjamin, and that also is going to play into the future roles of Israel. Benjamin's a very important tribe in Israel. At the end of the book of Judges, we're going to see a very tragic thing happen to the tribe of Benjamin, to the point that they are nearly completely decimated. And then they are rebuilt. The people of Israel help to rebuild the tribe of Benjamin until you have the point where the first king of Israel comes from the tribe of Benjamin, King Saul. And then, of course, later on we come across another man by the name of Saul of Tarsus, Paul in Greek, and he also is from the tribe of Benjamin. Um, so that's the identification that we have of Ehud. Now, we'll talk more about some more of those interesting details that come up here in a little bit. But the first thing I want us to think about when we read and study the story of Ehud is something that we all know very well, but it serves as a great reminder. The Bible reminds us of this constantly, is that sin comes with negative consequences. Now, Israel had been sinning for, after Othniel died, they were faithful. After Othniel had delivered them from the king named Cushan Rishathaim, who was the king of Mesopotamia. But then, after Othniel died, says the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And so the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel. God's hand was in this. Now, that seems really weird to us. Why would God use this kind of person who's not really even a servant of his to punish his own people? That's a question that is asked, and if you remember, several months ago, back when the pandemic first began, we did a series on the minor prophet of Habakkuk. And Habakkuk was asking this question of God when the Lord was promising to send Babylon to judge his people. And that tells us that it's not really something that's easy to understand. God answers Habakkuk, but he also tells him, "I'm doing something that even if I told you, you wouldn't understand, you wouldn't believe." So we have that as well. But we can get some pretty good. We can go through the Bible and get some pretty good implications. God's punishments of his people are not because he's angry, but because he is wanting to pull them back to him. This is discipline. The Bible tells us in multiple places, do not despise the chastening or the discipline of the Lord, because the Lord chastises those whom he loves as sons and daughters or as children. We see that in both the Old and the New Testament. When you go back to Genesis chapter 3, we bring up Genesis 3 a lot. I know it's the beginning of the Bible, but it's really central to so much of our understanding of the Bible and of God's relationship with us and what God wants to do for us and in us and even through us. At the end of that narrative in Genesis 3, when he dispenses the punitive actions against Adam and Eve and the serpent, he removes them from the Garden of Eden. And that seems to many to be the worst punishment of all. However, it's not. It's actually a mercy. We've talked about this before, and even the Bible implies the merciful nature of this action, because when he removes them out of the Garden of Eden, he says, lest they reach out their hand and eat of the tree of life and live forever, is what he's meaning there. Um, so what's so bad about that? What's so bad about living forever? Well, nothing if you're in a sinless state. If you're in a state that's full of sin, then living forever is just going to continue to cause trouble. And it's going to heap trouble upon trouble. And God makes that case over the next few chapters of Genesis, as those folks back then, leading up to the days of the flood, were living to be 1,000 years old. Um, we don't have any on record, and that doesn't mean that no one did live to be 1,000, but we don't have any record of anyone making it that far, but pretty close. Methuselah was 31 years short of his 1,000th birthday, um, and we only have one line there. There may have been others that made it over 1,000. We simply don't know. But that's neither here nor there. What we do see is God says that their life and the life of man is, they think about doing evil and violence from the moment that they're born, practically. So God dealt with that. Um, the flood, which was a punitive measure, was also a way of saving humanity. Um, and so we see the punishment of God is not meant for our destruction, but rather meant for our salvation, the discipline of God. There is coming a day in which the discipline of God will not be seen so much as a day of salvation, but rather as eternal condemnation. But that's a different topic. After the flood, of course, people were dying much sooner than what their predecessors were. Within just a generation, a century was being knocked off, 2 centuries, 3 centuries, until we get down to uh, where we are today. Um, I don't want to get into the debate about the age spans or anything like that, but just that was just to bring up um, the idea that discipline has to do with salvation rather than anger and rage. Okay, so that's really what we're seeing here. It could have just kept getting worse and worse. The sin of Israel could have kept getting worse and worse, but God decides to do something about it before it can. This is the pattern that God has. He gives people time to fix it on their own. Now, parents do that. A lot of parents do that all the time, don't we? We know our child's doing something, and we try to let them work it out, fix it. If they don't, you've got to step in and take measures to fix it yourself. The balance is waiting, knowing how long to wait without it getting too far. God knows where his people are, um, and so he will go in and he begins to strengthen the king of Moab. Moab will play an important role in Israel throughout much of its early history. Ruth is from Moab. Um, we'll run in, and Ruth does actually take place during the time of the judges. Um, a lot of different details are being thrown in there, but negative consequences come from our sin, and we must always remember that. We all know that. The people of Israel knew that. They knew what they were getting into, and they knew that it was going to lead to some problems that, as it had done in the past, they were not stupid, but they were just like us. We still sin, even though we know it's going to bring in negative consequences. If we don't know that our sin is going to bring negative consequences, then we're foolish. Um, We see families being destroyed. We see relationships, husbands and wives, being destroyed because someone decides to prioritize something or someone else over their relationship with their wife, over their relationship with God first, and then of course that trickles down to their wife and even their children. We see nations being destroyed because of the corrupt leaders. They have prioritized themselves over the people that they are supposed to be serving and protecting. We see this all over the world in many different nations. We even see this in the United States with some of the political folks. We see it all over. I mean, just sin is has cursed our entire world, and we see the negative consequences of our sin all over as well. And the perhaps the frightening thing about this is that when we do sin, and those negative consequences are not just going to be affecting us, they're going to affect people for generations. Sometimes on a small scale, perhaps that'll be passed down from one generation to the next in a family. Sometimes for many generations, and maybe even sometimes on a macro scale, where like with Abraham and Sarah, when they had rushed ahead of God and decided to have a child through Hagar, Sarah's handmaiden. We still deal with the negative consequences of that today in the Middle East, which has engulfed the entire world over several centuries. So we do have those things. And you never know what the end of them is going to be. So we strive to take care of our sin before it's too late. And God is taking care of Israel's sin here before it is too late, because He's a God who loves His people, and sometimes discipline is what is needed. It's not all, you know, teddy bears and roses. Love is sometimes tough, and that's what God does with His people here, so that He may bring them back to Him. There's so much more that we could say about evil and the consequences of sin. But I want us to move on to the next point I want us to think about, and is that God answers His people. When Israel was under the Moabite king Eglon for 18 years, they cried out to God. Now, you see the pattern here. You have a judge um, that God raises for the people to deliver them. They usually stay faithful. Not always. They usually stay faithful. Sometimes the judge actually leads them into sin after he's done doing the work that God called him to do. But they usually stay faithful while that judge is alive. And then after that judge dies, whether it be male or female, as we'll see in chapter 4, they sin again. God gives them a little while to try to figure it out. They don't. He sends someone to oppress them. Sometimes it lasts a few years, sometimes it lasts a few decades. Here it only lasts 18 years, and they called out to God, and God listened. He heard their prayer. That's a theme that we see developed through the Scripture in both Old and New Testaments, obviously, as the New is the conclusion of the Old, and they are calling out to God to deliver them. And it's interesting that He does again raise up someone to deliver them, but this time, instead of calling him a judge, He is a judge, but instead of calling him a judge, God simply calls him a deliverer. And I think that's interesting. Real quick, just want to make mention of that. That's interesting because what we have there is Jesus is a judge and deliverer as well. We will see that play out more in the New Testament. It is sad, as we're reading this story, and as we'll read other ones, go over other ones, that it takes Israel 18 years to realize they need to get back to God. I'm sure that there were people um, in Israel who knew all along the path that they were going was wrong. God always sets aside for Himself a remnant of faithful people, but the majority did not, and they went astray. We don't know the nature of their sin here, but they went astray. They left God, and it took them 18 years under under oppression before they realized that they were in need of God's deliverance and redemption. And here, the lesson here is that when we're in trouble, don't let God be your last option. Even when we're having difficulties with temptation and sin, we need to be calling upon Him to deliver us, um, asking Him to deliver us from whatever it is, keeping our connection open with our Father, so that we do not drift farther away from Him. We need to be in touch with Him, not just during the bad times, but also during the good times, giving Him thanks for the good times and asking Him to continue to watch over us, and that when we are brought to the hour of temptation or the hour of trial, that He will be with us and help us and guide us through that. We don't want to ever hesitate to call upon God, because He's always there and He will always answer our prayers, even when He answers them in a way that is unexpected. But rest assured, God is doing what is always good and what is always best for His people. The third thing I want us to think about is that God is always helping us, sometimes silently, and that's the thing that I wanted to bring up, I talked about earlier. God is silently helping His people. We don't always see God's intervention, um, and God has a big advantage over what we have, because He sees down the road all the way to the end of it. We don't. We can barely see right in front of our face. But God sees down the road, and sometimes He may intervene on our behalf, and we don't even realize He's intervened for us. I mean, think about all the times that you've been out on the road. Think about maybe you've seen an accident that happened just a few minutes, a few minutes after you left. Maybe you were running behind, and you thought being late was a problem. But if you would have left right when you wanted to, you may have wound up in that accident. May have even lost your life. And I don't know if God had anything to do with that, but I'd give Him praise for it. I know that's happened several times in my life. Um, I consider that things like that to be the providence of God. God is at work. He's taking care of you when things like that take place. Think about other things in your life that could apply here. Well, in this story, Ehud's story, everything fell into place. Look at the small details. Eglon had a great deal of pride, and that caused, and he had his servants to leave the room because of the pride that he had. He wanted to hear the message quietly that that Ehud had for the king. Another detail that we may overlook is that Ehud was a left-handed man. Most people, even in our world today, are not left-handed; they're right-handed, and so um, this allowed Ehud to have the element of surprise because of where he had the dagger wrapped around his right leg. A right-handed man would have had the dagger wrapped around his left leg, and so they would have checked that, but they were not thorough. And so, if that dagger would have been discovered before his attempt to assassinate the king, and he would not have had a chance to even get near Eglon. So there we see that falling into place. Also, if you remember in the story, Eglon, um, I'm sure his servants knew the kind of man that he had become. He was complacent. His pride led to his complacency, which led to him being overweight and unable to defend in the bathroom, I guess, relieving himself. And so that caused them to be embarrassed. They waited a while, and if they wouldn't have delayed, then Ehud wouldn't have had the opportunity to escape. I mean, just so many things going on here that we can see is done because of the providence of God. Hundreds of things could have gone wrong that day, but they didn't. they all happened the way they needed to be done because God provided His divine intervention. How many times has God done that for you? And it's even if you're a Christian today, think about that. Think about the people that had to become Christians for you to be here. Think about the people that have suffered and bled or persecuted throughout history, not in the last couple of generations here in America, the last several generations in America, but we got to look further back than that. We're talking about the apostles and the people after the apostles, talking about the people that risked their lives just to get the Bible translated into English and kept fighting despite all of the persecution and the problems that they were undergoing. We're talking about all of those types of things. God was involved in that. Um, His providence shines through, and so never think that you're a Christian um, just because it's the way it is. God made the cleared the path for people to decide. You still have the choice. We all have to decide whether or not we're going to become a Christian. He's cleared the path for everyone, especially in our country and culture, to put Christ on a baptism. Um, that's His providence. There will be no excuse on the day of judgment for billions of people because He's cleared the path, and we continue to see Him doing that even today. Well, that's about all I have for this evening when it comes to Ehud. I hope you got something out of the lesson that you can that will help you to grow in your faith, perhaps, and to appreciate the things that God has done and continues to do for you. Um, if any of you have need of prayer, or if you know of anyone who needs to be baptized or you need to be baptized, please let that be known, and we'll make sure that that's taken care of. Hope you all have a good week, and we will talk to you later. Bye bye.